As you can see, more participants are joining. Friends, welcome to the PAFI dialogue. We'll give a few more minutes before we officially start. I see more people are joining. And we're also already live on YouTube, but I'll give another...
We are.
Okay. I'll just give another few seconds before we start off. So we have... Okay, let's begin, friends. Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the PAFI dialogue with Ambassador Manjeev Puri, who's going to speak to us on COP26 and the implications for industry in India, especially. Ambassador Puri is a former Indian ambassador. He joined the Foreign Service in 1982 and has served as ambassador of India to the European Union, Belgium, Luxembourg, Nepal. He's also served as ambassador, deputy permanent representative of India to the United Nations in 2009 to 2012 in New York, a period during which India was on the Security Council. Prior to that, from 2005 to 2009, he headed the division in Ministry of External Affairs dealing with United Nations issues on social and economics side. In addition, he has served twice in Germany, in Cape Town, in Muscat, in Bangkok, and Caracas. He retired in 2019 December in the rank of Secretary to the Government of India. His major areas of experience relate to multilateralism, Europe, and Nepal. Ambassador Puri has a degree in management and did his BA honors in economics from St. Stephen's College in New Delhi. He is presently Distinguished Fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, and a Distinguished Visiting Fellow with the Ananta Center. The air quality in Delhi and the COP26 coincided one way or the other. And 2 weeks of the 26th conference of the United Nations Climate Change Conference ended on 13th November in Glasgow with some announcements. COP26, as it is popularly known, there were hard negotiations happened over several provisions on phasing out of coal or phasing down of coal. Some of these jargon will like Ambassador Puri to demystify for us. Cutting off greenhouse gas emissions, providing money to the developing countries, this whole issue of climate finance versus technology, and of course, the 5 commitments which the Honorable Prime Minister made at the Glasgow summit. When I requested Ambassador Puri, who I've known for several decades, to speak to us, it was purely from selfish reason because I saw one article written by him which was prior to Glasgow. And during Glasgow, I saw all these announcements, and from an industry point of view, I was wondering, what do I need to do as a public policy person within corporations to understand what has happened in Glasgow, which is essentially, I'm told, follow through to the Paris Agreement. But more so that what is it I need to do at the level of corporate to implement or to look out for what is going to happen once this whole Glasgow announcement is implemented. So that's the background. And with this brief introduction, it's really an honor for me to invite Ambassador Puri to address us. The way it will go is after me, Ambassador Puri will speak for about 15-20 minutes. We'll then open it for questions. He's very keen to have a dialogue. So please send in your questions through the chat box or the Q&A. And then in the end, we'll have Vinita wind up the session. So thank you so much, Ambassador Puri, once again, for taking time off your very busy schedule. And over to you. Thank you so much.
Ajay, thank you very much. Just a question. I hope everyone can hear me, see me, etc. Any adjustments that you think I need to make? You're all okay.
You're good to go, yeah.
Ajay, let me start by saying not just thank you to you, but ours being a friendship which has gone back to decades, and also several of your other members of PAFI. So let me say that the honor is entirely mine, that a friend should reach out. And frankly speaking, I just couldn't have been more thrilled. Of course, I must say that I am doubly honored at being called by a foundation and an institution which is taking full-page ads in Indian newspapers. So, I think I have in a sense arrived, and you have made me this particular opportunity. Thank you very much. So, friends, a little bit of my background. Ajay has, of course, given you my official CV. But, where do I come from and how am I involved in all of this, and how was I involved? So, in various ways, the world would pitch it to you that the climate negotiations are negotiations which are about global good, and they are negotiations about the climate, about environment, and at most they are negotiations about energy. Where do we source our energy from? How do we utilize it, etc., etc. But in reality, I think we need to understand another simple factor, which is that these are negotiations which essentially are no different than the negotiations which take place on most subjects in the world and are about international power play. And I'll leave a thought with you because it sort of gels with at least Ajay and my generation. When we grew up, the big conversations used to be about disarmament. And if you remember, the similar kinds of things that used to happen, nuclear missiles, etc., seem to be like yesteryear's discussion topics today. So the same kind of things happen. And so consequently, obviously, the involvement of the foreign ministry, given the strategic elements involved, had got to be there. I happened to be at the very critical time in 2005 for about 5 years, helming the United Nations division in the foreign ministry, and so consequently was among our lead negotiators at several of these key places, but most notably in Copenhagen, where, of course, the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh himself was present. After that, I was in New York for about 5 years, where also one was very closely involved in it. So I have an old association, and which post my retirement, TERI, an organization with which I've had an old and abiding institutional ties and links and friendships, asked me to come back. They also sent me to Glasgow to, look at some of their events, which are separate. So one had a feeling of what is happening and so on and so forth. Why did I say this to you? We began by Ajay making reference to air quality in Delhi and COP26 and what is happening. Now, usually for many people, pollution in various ways is not dissimilar. So whether it is water pollution or air pollution, etc., and rightly so, you look at it in terms of what it does to human health. So would greenhouse gases. But remember one thing, that greenhouse gases are causing global warming. And this warming then sets off a series of chain of events, which could include things such as, for example, which result in disease outflow, hunger outflow, agriculture, so many factors which could result in it. But remember one little thing, the largest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is water vapor. I mean, I'm saying this basically because you used the expression that you wanted a degree of demystification. Of course, the thing that we are all focused on, or rather the developed world is all focused on, is carbon. And I'll take a few minutes and just explain to you something which most of you in industry would be familiar with. Look, since humankind, about 200 odd years back, discovered more efficient use of carbon than merely burning wood, the way we fuel our economy changed drastically. First was coal, then was hydrocarbons, and then their admixture in various things have drastically changed the way we work. So let's be very clear on the analysis, which is the situation till today. The more the energy you produce, the more you will burn, the greater will be your GDP. And let me put it very bluntly to PAFI, whose members are august people in our society, the more power you have in the global world. I think we should be quite crystal clear on what all of this means. So for the developed world, which has been doing this for now 150 years plus, the time had come to have a look at what is happening in terms of global rebalancing, etc. Now, I'm not saying that climate change is not happening. Climate change is happening very much so. But let's ask, why are the demandeers coming from a particular part of the world and why others are looking at what they can do for themselves? So it was in this kind of scenario that in the late 1980s that the idea of climate change took birth and has gone on further. Now, one of the interesting things to note as is that these greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, which is the most talked about gas, which is as a result of burning of fossil fuels, has a huge half-life. It remains in the atmosphere for nearly a century, and therefore what happened in the time of our grandparents impacts us today and will continue to impact us. In fact, the best example being that during COVID, the world saw a huge fall in its GDP, i.e. economies all over the world tanked, and yet, please note that the disastrous impacts of climate change continued, whether it was wildfires in California or fires in Australia or floods and oceanographic surges in the subcontinent here with us or anywhere else in the world. And so therefore, for many of us in the developing world, some of the key issues become that of what is called adaptation, i.e. this has happened. We are going to face its consequences irrespective of where we are. So how do we build resilience? How are we able to tackle it? And the technical word used for this is adaptation. Now, of course, I think it's a truism. The richer you are, the better you'll be able to adapt, the more you'll be able to take care of yourself. So in a sense, the issue of development versus all of this. But let me come to the main subject, which is touched upon by everyone. And the subject matter is that of what is in climate parlance called mitigation. And mitigation is essentially cutting down the production of greenhouse gases, which effectively till now has meant carbon dioxide. But at this COP onwards, a great deal of conversations have started with another very important greenhouse gas, which till now has been underplayed, but which can have great ramifications for India, which is methane. And why do I say so? For a very simple reason: livestock, which tends to produce methane. We have very large numbers of livestock in India, and they are integral to our geography. And secondly, rice production. Rice production through waterlogging results in the release of methane. There was, in fact, a time when people thought that its coefficient was very high. I don't know what the science will say on it. But either way, South Asia, India in particular, becomes, let me say, in the center of the eye on the issue of methane. Now, these are the sort of backgrounds to all of this. The UN Convention was started in the mid-1990s, but the Western world, in a very interesting sweet spot in terms of international governance, the mid-1990s, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and there was a G1 in the world, they agreed to the creation of the WTO, which is essentially based on one country, one vote, unlike the United Nations, where 5 countries have a veto, or like the World Bank and IMF, where the United States has a golden vote which can stop things from happening. These were created, and so were the UN Conventions on Climate Change, Biodiversity, and Desertification. But coming to the Climate Change Convention. So the principal route for action on climate change is that of the UN Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change. And one of its salient principles, which was agreed again by the entire world, is what is called the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. Now, today we can keep talking that how does it matter? We are also becoming very rich. We will also do our bit. Why are you talking about differentiation? They did it or they didn't. But the reason is that in the convention, it was accepted that it is not just current emissions which matter, but historic emissions matter because they continue to impact. And so therefore, it is not only a question of what your current capabilities are, but what you have contributed to the problem, at least in proportion to that, you should be willing to act. And that is where the Western world today accounts for over 60 to about 66% of the emissions which sit in the atmosphere and which continue to impact them. And hence, these demands on differentiation. Now, there was a protocol called Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed upon towards the end of the 1990s, in which the developed world agreed to take on commitments to cut down on its greenhouse gas emissions. Nothing for the developing world. But when it came into force in 2004, the United States was not a party. And the entire game was, we are getting out of it. Why? Because the global situation had changed and the rise of China was by then self-evident to everyone. And everyone started using expressions such as free riders, you can't have shoveling money to China, etc. And India, in a sense, falls in the same. So we have to balance this entire business of India and our development imperatives versus India and our aspirations on the high table and what you see in terms of our aggregate. Let me leave a simple thought with you. India is the only G20 member with a per capita income of perhaps under $2,000 in real terms. And real terms matter, not these purchasing power parity terms, which are more conversation subjects rather than anything else in terms of international comparison. But we have a GDP which is already making us the fourth largest economy in the world. And in all probability, we will be the third largest economy in the world in the next 10 years. So you see the dichotomies that we have to learn to live with. Let me now take you straight to what happened then. Thereafter was Paris, where in a sense, the hammering out of the Kyoto Protocol happened. It in a sense came to an end and the whole world agreed to take voluntary commitments. India on its part took on huge voluntary commitments in terms of how much of renewable energy will form part of our grid. Our energy intensity of our GDP will drop, and we took commitments on that. And we are basically on track in trying to reach those. Most other countries in the G20 are not. They give the excuse of COVID, etc. But frankly speaking, they haven't made the kind of efforts that we've made. There's no doubt about that at all. So we went to Glasgow. Now let's look at another thing, again, talking about global power play. Why is Glasgow so important? In the normal course of things, it would have been yet another COP. But something very interesting happened. The moment the COP in Paris agreed to the world being on board in trying to do something about climate change, the situation in the United States changed, and Mr. Donald Trump became president of the US, and he pulled out of the Paris Accord. This was the second time the United States had pulled out of climate accords. The first was the Kyoto Protocol, where they pulled out when Clinton, a Democrat, was there, and although Al Gore had negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. This time, Donald Trump, a Republican, pulled out from there. And so all of us took a 4-year hiatus, extended by 1 year because of Kyoto, because of COVID. No one really paid much attention. In the meantime, was the sun keeping quiet? Was the greenhouse gases keeping quiet? Was everything hunky-dory? No, it wasn't. Global warming has continued. And today the IPCC and others are pointing out that you've been not just slow, you've actually been laggards. You've missed opportunities one after the other. Hence came the change which happened as a result of President Biden taking over. I'm spending some time on this only to give you a background of the way the world happened. I think most of you would agree that if Donald Trump had got re-elected, hardly anyone would have gone to Glasgow, hardly anyone would have talked about it. But there was a sea change in the United States atmosphere. The largest player, they're not just the world's largest economy, they are the largest emitters in historic terms, although today China is a larger emitter than what they are. Yeah, I won't, I'll speak. The fact of the matter is, these are things which are very important, and people need to understand that the name of the game here is not just altruistic and doing the right thing, but has much to do with the nature of the global power equations which rest, and in terms of who's got what technologies, etc. What did we do at Glasgow? Now, let's leave aside what may or may not have been happening. The fact was that the great things that the world wanted to do, or rather the Western world wanted to do, was, one, get the entire world to agree to net zero by 2050. What this essentially means, and I want to spend a minute on this, not that globally we will achieve net zero, which means the amount of GHGs that we will emit will be equal to the amount which is sequestrated through carbon sinks like forests, etc. Not that the world will do it as a total, but that every country will sign up to the thing, which meant that differentiation, of course, was going to be given for a toss. But what happened at the end in Glasgow? Countries like India, China came forward and said, not 2050, we'll do it in 2060. A country like India came forward and said, well, our development needs are such that we can't do it in 2050. But here it is. We will take a commitment and do it by 2070. Now, sitting in the Western world where you want things done today, what you should have done yesterday, you can say that 2070 is too late. But most people recognize that India had made a commitment that at least over the next several years, they will make conscious efforts to cut down on the greenhouse gas emission. And what does this 2070 mean? I think I must point out to people. It isn't what many people would say, oh, it's 50 years from now. How does it matter? My children or grandchildren will take care of it. But it isn't. It is about the world starting to ask you from very soon, what are your plans in terms of what will be realized in 2070? So you need to start laying out credible plans in front of the world and putting them out to review as to how you are in the business of controlling the GHG emissions in your economy right from now onwards. Then comes a very important point, which is that of peaking, because the entire issue, if you see, is not of reaching zero, but which is the high point. And let me draw your attention to something very interesting. Lord Nicholas Stern, who used to head the London School of Economics once upon a time, and is a sort of a big individual in terms of climate expenses and so on, put out a tweet welcoming Prime Minister Narendra Modi's announcement of net zero in 2070 and said, you have also rightly challenged the developed world. But then added a line in the middle, and India has now pledged that on 2030 they would have peaked. Now, you and I can ask the question, where did you do it? The answer lies in the 4 other commitments that we took. It's a way of looking at it. You and I may disagree, but somebody else who comes from a different perspective will look at it and point it differently. We said we will raise our renewables, total amount of renewable production from 450 gigawatts, what we were talking about, to 500. Difficult, but let's accept it. Then we made an announcement that 50% of our total energy output or capacity, whichever way you want to put it, will be renewables. Now, for many people, let's leave the thought. Today, you are doing about 250, 300 at most gigawatts of fossil fuel generated electricity. So you have left some space, but rightly so, since we need to grow and there is no way we can step back. The third thing we said was we will reduce our energy intensity of GDP from the currently laid down figure of 33% by 2020 to 45%. And the fourth one, that we will reduce our overall GHGs which are emitted by 1 billion tons by 2030. Now, in our understanding, this is over a cumulative period. But as you can make out in the game of global power play, the other guy says, so what you emit per year, you will reduce by 1. And if you reduce by 1 for a country which is doing under 3 today, obviously by 2030, there is a good chance of your peaking. That's the nature of the global power play and how things will happen. Ajay mentioned the question. So all of you would have agreed that when the Honorable Prime Minister made these announcements, we had every reason to think that we had gone well beyond our call to make announcements which were in global good, of course in our good, but that we should be applauded. And yet, how did we come into the question that on the last day, the Indian origin Britain, who's the president of COP, Alok Sharma, said we will ask India and then China to explain why they have a problem with coal. And what was it that happened? There was a phrase inserted in the final text, and that was about what to do with fossil fuels. And the question was whether the phrase to be used would be phase down or phase out. Now, you and I, in our normal parlance, can say, how does it make any difference? But in words matter, and in international negotiations, especially those which are creating soft law, words matter. The phrase phase out, incidentally, was used in a US-China text agreed just 2-3 days earlier. So obviously, the phrase was not ours. The phrase came, in a sense, given to us, but it was our minister who led it. I'm afraid there are certain consequences to it, at least momentarily. And so the entire hullabaloo that you saw, and that will continue for quite some time. But it also makes the point to everyone that coal is important for us today in terms of our energy mix. And it's not something that we can simply wish away and look the other way, or that tomorrow we can shut it down. Ajay, you started by asking me the issues, not just of what happened there, to which we can, keep adding our own twists and understandings of what happened. These are global negotiations, and at every stage, it is the effort of everyone to trip the other guy and not necessarily to act in global good, as is generally put. But you asked me what are the implications for India. So in my opinion, the first and fundamental point is, unlike Paris, which was immediately followed by the defeat of Barack Obama's Democrat Party and the election of Donald Trump, who essentially was a climate denier, and hence climate took an absolute backseat in global politics. That is not going to happen. If that is not going to happen, then let us remember that a country like India, whose economy is going places, will have no choice but to keep answering questions on what is happening in terms of India's greenhouse gas emissions. And if I may add, the issue of methane, which will also come up very soon and again become a major issue given our livestock and the fact that we are major rice producers in the world. So without any doubt, climate change is now something that we in India need to be cognizant that it will have to be internal to our economy, to the way we think, and I dare say to Indian industry. Now, I must tell you, Terry had made an effort with Indian industry in the run-up to COP26, and we were very pleased to find more than 50 senior industries and industrialists having tied up to a net zero by 2050. And we had a side event on this also. So I'm not saying that the entire industry needs to side up, but I want everyone to be cognizant that the need to be aware that green and its implications are now global. And I'm afraid India, which wants to be part of the global economy in an ever bigger manner, cannot not be part of that. This is the first and important thing. For those of you who are in international businesses, raising monies for fossil fuel run things, especially high-end things such as coal, is going to be willy-nilly difficult to do. It's not just that the China, the United States, the G7, etc., have said that they won't support these plants outside, but willy-nilly, this is going to become difficult. I believe, as far as India is concerned, the world keeps making these demands, 100 billion a year by the developed world to be made available for actions in the developing world. I want to leave a thought with all of you. This is money which is more in the nature of grant money which may go to the multilateral development banks. It hasn't come as yet, but as and when it comes, I have my doubts whether large developing countries like India would really be able to access it the way we used to access IDA funds, for example, 30, 40 years back. At best, it may be a curve available for us to be able to play the leveraging role, i.e. use this money in a multilateral development bank for a better rating so that you can de-risk, you can avoid first loss, you can provide for first loss guarantees, you can do several of those things. But frankly, we in India need to prepare ourselves to be in the international market. And there, let me assure you that one of the buzzwords that will become important is the question of green, and which will mean aligning India and ourselves to global taxonomies, which means the global rules and regulations about green. I again leave this thought very strongly with our friends in the industry. Now, let me also make another point. Where are business opportunities? Of course, there is no doubt that in the coming years in countries like India, there would be tremendous business opportunities in the areas of solar powers, rolling it out, etc. I also think there would be tremendous opportunities in terms of alternate fuels. The world is talking about hydrogen as the alternate to carbon. I hope that is the case. But today, the state of play is such that while the technology may be available, and it may be powering rockets which are taking us to outer space, their rollout and their commercial feasibility on all of that is things that will have to be worked out. The question of being able to generate hydrogen in such large amounts itself is something that will have to be worked out. And frankly, if you don't mind my saying so, India is second to none in terms of implementing what the world has done and what the world is doing well. But is India a leader in being able to do it? I know we all like the idea of saying yes, but I have my doubts. And I really believe that this is again the place where the developed worlds have to take the lead. And they must show this by actual implementation on the ground. I haven't spoken about adaptation, resilient opportunities for people in the entire area of green. But I see that I've already spoken for about half an hour, so I'll try to end. But I want to leave a thought with all people in industry that whether they like it or not, green, decarbonization, more use of electricity, different fuels other than carbon, these are things I'm afraid, even in a country like India, especially for those industries which want to be globally competitive, which want to be part of the globe, I'm afraid they have little choice, not because we in India may enjoin policy prescriptions to make that happen, but because they want to be part of the world, that they have little choice to try and align themselves to that. I want to thank you, Ajay. I hope I haven't overshot my 15 minutes by more than another 15 minutes. But thank you so much. I'm open to discussions, take questions, etc. from your friends. Thank you.
Ambassador Puri, thank you so much. For a person who is a policy watcher, this was a great learning for me. The way you explained this whole issue of adaptation to mitigation and what the industry needs to do. We no longer can sit on the side and just watch the game. So I'm going to kick off the discussions. I'm tempted to ask the question myself, but my colleague Raman Sidhu was keen to go first. So over to you, Raman.
Thank you, Ajay. It was not to go first, but to put a question to the very capable Ambassador Manjeev Puri. This COP, as it's called, in our country, we also love these acronyms. But this Conference of Parties that signed the UNFC Cube in 1994 after nearly 27 years, met. And it was supposed to be the first major test of the 2015 Paris Agreement, where they'd agreed to limit various things and maintain global average temperatures to well below 2% and not to exceed 1.5, etc. But a doubt remains in a number of people's minds. So that's part of my questions. There'll be one more. Is it about, it was supposed to be about taking action and not talking shop, or simply making plans, because that has been going on ad nauseum. And because everyone does realize that this was perhaps our best chance in Glasgow to avoid future catastrophic impacts from a warming world. Do you believe, one, that all that we were able to reach was a sort of a compromise deal? Because there were areas such as ending fossil fuel subsidies, phasing out coal. There's no agreement on some of these things. Is it that's my first question? Do you personally feel it's a compromise deal? Number two, you made a very important point about industry not being able to access global funds, whether they are commercial in nature, whether they're bilateral, whether they're multilateral, going ahead. And if you build in to this fact, this difficulty, the fact that India to date, since project financing evolved as a way out of funding major projects such as power, today also we have not achieved even one simple, straightforward project finance deal in this country. Project finance has not happened because there is not an agreement reached in any major deal of parking, equitably parking and accepting the risks in that project. Until that happens, and I'll give an example for others who are there. For instance, carrying coal from the coal field to where the project is being set up, the Indian Railways takes that responsibility to a great extent. But to date, Indian Railways is not agreeable that in case the coal that was measured, the quality tested at the point of origin was actually what reached the plant or the power plant. And that is one of the many reasons why a pure project finance deal has not taken place. But now there'll be increasing pressure on anyone who wants to get into these major projects of being able to access funds. So that is a clear implication for industry. The other thing is you mentioned solar. Now solar, it's all very well to talk about solar. We talked about wind power. Wind power actually came before solar started taking off. But there is still a lot of shortcomings in equitable, truly equitable power purchase agreement being in existence. Evacuation of power, these still remain. And in addition to these, if you have the added problem of not being able to access funds, that is a concern that industry should focus on. Your comments and your answer to the first question.
Ajay, if you will agree, may I take the question?
Yes,
Yeah.
what we'll do after this, Manjeev, we already have people put questions on the chat in the Q&A box. I'll encourage more and more participants to do that while Ambassador Puri is answering Mr. Sidhu's question. Over to you.
Thank you. So Raman, thank you very much. Two excellent questions. So let me talk about the first one. You know, what are UN conferences? They are about global burden sharing. You know, if they were all about global good, you think there should have been any great difficulty in reaching a conclusion? No, but they are about global burden sharing, isn't it? Now, why is the nature of the burden sharing? Now, you can keep saying that, you know, we have this catastrophe in front of us. But let me put it to you like this. The catastrophe is also in front of the developed world. And everybody knows what the state of play is. Yet the nature of human nature is such that unfortunately or fortunately, we are in the business of negotiating burden sharing. And that's exactly what is happening. There is also a feeling in some in the developed world that we have the abilities to be resilient. We have the abilities to be able to adapt. And that the problem is more yours than others. I don't know the answers to these things. But essentially, the point that I want to make to you is that these are not talk shops, but they are displays in a sense of the power games that go on. And this is a power game on a global good. Unfortunate, but power games on global goods have happened so many times in the past, whether it's on development cooperation. I mean, have you had any discussions of this kind of poverty alleviation in the world? The answer is no. Isn't that the greatest global disservice at all to the world? So these things happen. This is the nature of the game. But, you know, let me also say this. These are not exercises in futility. They are exercises which slowly but surely change global mindsets. Raman, when you and I started off our careers, how many of us would have thought that coal was a bad name? How many of us would have said that hydrocarbons are going to get extinct in our time? And how many of us thought that solar rooftops were anything other than a bit of a luxury and having a little bit of fun? But in our times, we have seen this happening, isn't it? Of course, how many of us really realized that China would become the largest economy in the world? Well, things happen. These negotiations, they focus global minds. And when they start focusing global minds, things start happening not slowly, but fast. For example, the European Union, which is a leader in setting global trends, if they adopt a taxonomy on what is green, then the question that you asked about raising finances, and if we find that we are unable to enter into any of their definitions of what is green, can you imagine what even the largest players in India will find when they go overseas to try and raise money for that? That your project doesn't fall into the definition. Hence, the little bit of arbitrage or the availability itself will become problematic. So these negotiations are therefore critical. They are very important. And I believe, it is my understanding, that what Glasgow should do is it should awaken, and I'm sure much in Indian industry, those who are progressive, those who are forward-looking are already aware. It isn't for nothing that the largest Indian industrialists have already announced that the new oil is going to be renewable. But let us be clear that it's not just enough for one person to be prescient. But I think all of you and your entire genre of Indian industry now needs to start engaging with all of this, and more than anything else, keeping yourself abreast of what is happening in the world, because its impact will be on all of you. the way you do business, the way the Indian economy will go. Why do I say this again and again? Because it is my belief, no matter what we want to do about Atmanirbhar, etc., we are essentially a member of the global open society's world. We want to be part of that. Yes, we want to do a lot made in India, make in India. We want to have our own capacities and ability, but we essentially want to be part of the world. We are not an isolationist economy and a society. Hence, for all of you, it is particularly important. Please keep yourself abreast. And secondly, please reach out to your government and to other governments with ideas and things that are of interest to you. Because it should not be just that the government knows what is good for you. Also think in terms of what you need. I'm not wanting to use old-fashioned words like lobbying, putting your point forward, but this is important. Think of it not really as the budget statement next year, what will happen, but think of it in terms of being involved. And that was my greatest purpose when Ajay invited me, to make it all clear to people. Last time after Paris, things should have changed, but Donald Trump intervened. Unlikely that you will have a Donald Trump next year. And if it doesn't happen for the next 3-4 years, this change, the C word becoming problematic, green becoming an important element, and all issues which are germane to it, whether it is the production of carbon dioxide, methane, etc., whether it is resilience or adaptation, whether it is raising money or finding technologies or collaborating with technology, it will become integral to the way you do your business. And of course, I dare say, there would be many people who would say that if your air conditioner cannot be marketed as green, it won't sell. I mean, these are all the things that come out of it. You know this much better than me. But frankly speaking, the third largest economy in the world, its industry needs to be active, proactive, and certainly involved with the issues of climate change. Raman, you raised the question about monies and their availability. I'm afraid this is the reality in the world. I think we need to understand this. The global systems in which we have been really small players. You know, India hasn't done sovereign borrowings for a variety of reasons. We call it that our conservative nature of our Reserve Bank, etc. Fine, all that is fine. But we are not major players in the international market. But tell me, if you want to become a $5 trillion economy, and more than that, if you want to be the third largest economy in the world, do you think that all of this will be possible without your being a bigger player in the global markets? And do you think our large corporates, etc., now can just laugh, wink once in a while to do a masala bond one day, have a rock concert the next day with Amjad Ali Khan and then come back? No, not at all.
No.
You will have to make this integral. Remember also, funding from the multilateral organizations such as the World Bank, etc., will become increasingly difficult for a country like India at concessional terms. You will at best be able to leverage what they are in a position to. Because of, on the one hand, the question of demand by the least developed countries, the smaller countries, they have nowhere else to turn to. And you know, the sort of philanthropy and charity of the world will turn towards them. They provide numbers, they don't provide competition to those who are the haves of today. And at the same time, they need you. To us, the answers are very simple. You know, I don't want to use words, but they would call you free riders. They'll call you all of that. So you have to get into the world, which means we will have to understand how we structure these things. You know, I'll leave with you a thought. I am a part of a group which is having discussions with the European Union on financing. And I'm not talking about grant financing and so on. We are really talking about how India and Indian corporates can reach global financial markets. And the biggest problem we find, they are going ahead with their taxonomies. We're not even in the game. We're not even discussing. We are not even talking about it. Frankly, they'll set the taxonomy. Then what will you be doing? Either some companies in India will simply align themselves to those taxonomies at cost to themselves. All the rest of us will be left. We'll be complaining, moaning and groaning. It don't help. It is time for us to actually realize that if these are our ambitions, this is what we are doing. Let's take that leap forward. Let's go ahead. Let's figure out the taxonomy. And can we try and see that the world's taxonomies are also such that they are somewhat relatable to what we are doing in India? And what are we doing? So, ESG frameworks is fine, but I do think the financial authorities in India, as well as the large corporates, etc., need to get their act together. Or let me just say a simple thing, defining what is green. Let's understand that. And then, Raman, you come to all the points about power purchase agreements, how you run the electricity sector and all. Frankly, all that is yours. In the main game plane, if in the world you are unable to be able to attach the green tag in terms of their taxonomy, you're going to find it very difficult to raise global funds. I think one of our largest players is finding that out in a country down under.
True.
Ambassador Puri, thank you so much. I think in your detailed response, you've covered some of the questions which some of the participants have raised. But I'm going to take two questions together, and I'll request you to answer these together if possible. One is from Rahul Sharma. Rahul also heads the young PAFI, so to say, PAFI under 40. His question is, what does it mean for global multinationals who today are doing business across developed and developing world, which are at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of what they seek as part of the negotiations, and their operations would well be part of both the emissions as well as the solutions on both sides. So that's an interesting question. I have questions from Mubarak Ali, but I think you've answered it partly, and also from Malvika on the whole idea of the greenhouse. But there's an interesting question from Rakesh Thukral, who's saying that thank you very much for your perspective. We started the conversation with Delhi's air quality. Majority of new cities are yet to be built in India. Is our state level governance structure ready to take on the climate change challenge? So if you could take on these two questions, then I'll come back to you later. Thank you so much.
And thank
you,
you
Ajay.
also,
This is
Manjeev.
really an interesting spread. We have global multinationals and federal states in India. So let me start with global multinational. Look, one of the interesting things that came out of the of the Glasgow COP, if you recall, after Kyoto, and a mechanism was adopted for allowing a kind of international carbon trading. It used to be called the Clean Development Mechanism. So if you did something good in India and earned carbon credits, some chap sitting in the Netherlands could buy it off from you, and a kind of exchange mechanism was built. When Kyoto was scrapped, all the monies, and a country like India has a lot of credits lying in its account, all got scrapped and nobody knows what is going to happen to them. The great hope was that in Glasgow, we'll be able to kickstart it. Well, they weren't able to kickstart it, but I must say I'm happy that at least there were conversations which said that we need a market mechanism, which means some kind of trading fixes are going to come about. In Glasgow, they talked in terms of a threshold starting in 2021, i.e. prospective action. But, are we saying that all that happened in the past and is lying in the bank is going to be washed away? I personally think as we negotiate things further, people will have to recognize that you can't just wish away things that people have done as a result of good work and so on, and contributed to the global solution, and just tell them, sorry, and go and just forget about it. So I think that's particularly important. Now, what were global multinationals doing? They were doing this within themselves, isn't it? So Rahul, whether you were doing transfer pricing or you were doing manufacture in India and sell through your subsidies elsewhere, or bring your brand name from somewhere else, you were doing it in any case. My understanding is that global multinationals will, and I speak as an ex-employee of Unilever, having started my career as in Hindustan Lever. I don't know, Rahul, where you're working, but the old greatest of them all. The fact of the matter is, most of the standards will be set based on what are the acceptable norms and standards in the West. Their companies and corporates in India and in the developing world will certainly keep carving out a certain space for themselves and telling their owners there at the other end that, look, we are giving you profits, why are you so bothered? But the fact of the matter is that beyond a point, it will change. If you don't mind my giving you an example from Unilever, the whole world moved away from margarine and hydrogenated fats a long time back, but we kept on producing dalda. In fact, that was my first job. So these things happen, they will happen, your companies will adjust, but I think the global mood is that you will perhaps become leaders of all of this, even in the developing world where you are, and bring this out, because A, that will be expected by you, by your global shareholders, and B, it is something in which you will claim a special credit and therefore be at the forefront. So I see a certain opportunity for all of you. It's not just that you will have to surmount problems, but I see opportunity, and I see that you're having, again, a head start in the way things are. I think companies which are homegrown in India and in the developing world, well, they always have to play catch up. And that's their disadvantage, if I may say so. Their advantage is they are homegrown, they have their other assets to what they can lay their hands on. In terms of state government, look, Ajay, I am not much of an expert in knowledge on state government, but I have no doubt that state governments in India are cognizant of the need for climate action. One of the things that most state governments in India know very well is that when there are problems, it is they who have to face them. So let us talk about the things that we mentioned, whether it is surges in the ocean, or it is floods, or it is agriculture falling, or water table issues. Who is it that needs to come to the fore? The state government. So the state governments will be in the fore of what the world calls adaptation action, but what we would say are actions needed to adapt to the situation which is arising. And state governments have an understanding. They have lower levels of capacity, and more than anything else, I believe in India, they are very stretched for funds. They don't have the money. This is where a country like India at the larger scale, if you can get your act together, you are in a position then to be able to roll out templates which state governments can use. Have we not used it for the green revolution? Have we not used it for the milk revolution? Have we not used it for so many other facets? Really, we need to leverage our largeness as a country and as an economy to be able to attract both money as well as technology. But the state governments are going to be in the forefront of facing the music, and therefore I have little doubt in my mind that they need to ramp up their capacities to be able to deal with this. And I think you're very right. I have the same sets of apprehensions as you have, because that is what was reflected in your question.
Thank you, Mr. Puri. I have two questions from Malvika Mudgal. I think the first question is probably you've already answered. I'll take the second question. What is your view on greenwashing? Many companies have been brought to attention to this aspect. Would you please share your thoughts on this greenwashing?
Look, Ajay, this entire business of washing, whether it's green or laundry or money or whatever else. Look, the global economy, the moment you get into this business of trading, etc., allows for all this, doesn't it? Now, I have a very simple, perhaps not so very moralistic view on all of these things. And my understanding is that as long as these things follow principles of regulation and declaration, there should be no issue with all of them. So whether you are talking in terms of carbon trading, whether you are talking about, sort of declaring my product to be green as a result of buying some credit from somewhere or the other and doing all of this, as long as I am able to contribute to a global goal. Because remember, climate change is a global problem. Ajay, if the United States emits today, you and I suffer in India. Similarly, if we emit today and there are implications, even Russia, South China Sea, small Pacific islands, they suffer as a consequence. This being a problem which is global, elements of globalness in its solution are not something that we should have major issues. So I don't want to get too much into the issues of the legality, the morality, but I really do believe that as long as there are regulations and as long as these are declared, then there are fair ways of going about, let me say, tackling the thing. This is the business environment that you have carved out.
Mr. Puri, people are leaving notes on the chat box that this is in a master class on education on COP26. We are inching towards 4:56, so we want to close on time, but I would like you to speak a bit about, increasingly companies, global corporations, global institutions, including the World Economic Forum, and the membership of the forum are focusing a lot on the ESG. And then you have all these funding initiatives linked to the ESG, as you rightly said. And even corporates are finding it difficult to progressively will find difficult to raise money, as you said. So how do you look at net zero, ESG, this whole thing of climate financing from a corporate point of view? Do you think this whole climate financing funding would also be available to companies, or would it be limited to countries? How will it work?
So Ajay, this is a very important question. And let me tell you, India, as I said, wants to be part of the world. Therefore, it isn't that for nothing that SEBI and others have introduced ESG. Each and every one of us in any company that we are involved with, we are trying to up the share of ESG relevant activity. This is part of the global conscious. Let's be very clear. And it is my understanding that Indian corporates, especially those who are listed, who are upwardly mobile, who want to be progressive and who want to be part of the world, are not going to be wanting to be left behind. So I have absolutely no doubt. So, environmental activity, the entire business of social responsibility, good governance, they are now going to be integral. In fact, time may come when each and every one of them may have to be tackled separately and not just as an ESG lump as we are currently looking at it. Because that's the nature of the way the globalized world is moving. And we have very little choice in that matter. I believe we need to understand in India that given the fact that we are a country which is and wants to be increasingly part of the open, democratic, free market world as far. Therefore, the norms which get set, unfortunately, in a sense, we are root takers at the moment, but hopefully when we grow our economy much more and become far bigger, we might become those who are contributors to making the root. But in that sense, we want to be part of it. And so therefore, ESG, etc., will become more important. And if they are subject matters in which at various levels the boards need to be engaged. And let's put it very simply, are they not good for the India, the country? You mentioned the question about money. Look, Ajay, that 100 billion, etc., is going to be essentially not dissimilar to what used to happen with poverty alleviation funds, i.e. going to multilateral funding, etc. But for me, I leave the thought with your people in particular. The key issue is larger Indian corporates who really require the larger amount of funds. They will have to reach out to global markets much the same way as players in the rest of the world. And for that, I hope that they are preparing themselves. But any of us who are representatives of India should ensure that India is integrated into the scheme that comes in the world. That doesn't mean that we simply agree to what is there. We try and become part of the rule makers rather than simply being lumped with what is given to us.
Puri,
somebody asked a question about coal mining, Ajay. If I can,
yes. Just
a second.
Pankaj Satija.
It is by far the most difficult subject, isn't it? Let me say about 6-8 months back when we spoke about the ideas of new licenses, renewing old mines, there was a global hue and cry on the subject. And in fact, many people would say that, you were in a sense the it on coal, on what you are doing in terms of coal in Glasgow, and that what happened was not accidental, but in a sense you invited it, and it was designed that it would hit you. But let us remember the amount of coal that is used by both the United States and China in terms of per capita ratios, both in terms of energy and in terms of their mining, is far more than what India uses incidentally. This is something that we should know. That we should be aware that coal is not going to be the great choice of future, even though we require it today, if nothing else in terms of balancing power, because today, while solar certainly is equal to thermal in terms of daylight hours, it's not right throughout the day, and there are various other issues there. So thermal will remain important for India, but the fact that its sunset has, in a sense, begun is something that we also need to internalize ourselves.
Ambassador Puri, I'm tempted to extend the session, but I'm mindful that you're on a personal time off in Chandigarh. So regretfully, we'll have to close the session. I'll request my colleague Vinita to formally propose a vote of thanks. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Puri. This was incredible a session. I think COP26 represents such a bold step, and we were all kind of following up on what was happening. But the devil is in the details, and what you've really taken us through has at least got me thinking, coming from the service sector, and we know that every sector has to play its role. One key message that has come out of what you've told us, and what I feel is so critical for us as PAFI also to take up, is how does industry get aware, abreast of what is happening? 2, how do we engage? And 3, how do we complement government's efforts if we really have to, as you said, not just take the rules that are going to be given to us, but become active stakeholders in making those rules? The second thing that you very clearly told us is Indian industry has to grow on the global stage. We need to be a part of the global taxonomy. We need to be a part of the growth, a green growth tag. And it's heartening to see that many of the large manufacturing companies have been able to give net zero pledges. My concern is the large MSME sector that we have, the large opportunity today that we have to be a part of the global value chain. The very fact that you also mentioned the conflict between developed and developing countries and differentiated responsibilities and outsourcing, which is going to come to India and China. How are we going to really get our not just the large corporations, but members who are our vendors, members who really are not just in the rural sector again, but also in the service sector, to be a part of this scientific basis for net zero pledges. And my final thing, I think, where again PAFI has a role to play, a very strong role to play, is how do we foster this coordinated climate governance and not just climate financing? I think we have to move away from different siloed industries, which are today governing rules for us to be defined under our ESG goals. How do we bring all of this together? So I think what you've given us today is I would say, Ajay, a kind of a homework, a platter where there's a lot for PAFI and our members to come together to brainstorm and see what we can come up with before this group reconvenes in Egypt next year. At least some beginning and some guidance for us to be better able to, for example, even in urban areas. You spoke of climate finance. Today there was an article on municipal bonds. Maharashtra doing well and some of the states taking a lead. How does the local industry also participate in it in a better way in a federal system? So huge challenges, Ambassador Puri. We hope you will be with us in helping us navigate these, in helping us set our targets better. And we in Public Affairs Forum of India are really thankful for you for sparing time to be with us. But we'll keep seeking your guidance and your counsel going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ambassador Puri, as Vinita said, this is not the first of such interaction. This is first of many. We will lean on you because as Public Affairs Forum of India, we are looking at larger stakeholder engagement in public policy making, in advocacy from the industry point of view, from our members' point of view. And we see that there is a role for us to play, and you have shaken us up a little bit today. And we will come back to you with some action points and maybe request your guidance on how we can work with you and Terry together. With this, I'll close the session. Ambassador Puri, much appreciated. Thank you, Vinita. Thank you all the participants for joining the PAFI dialogue. Until we meet next time.